how do we know that evolution is true? Or that it's a fact? And not just some made up concept by these crazy scientists? Well, we have 5 lines of evidence. First one are what we call fossils. You see, fossils are things that are left behind by organisms that have lived in the past. You see, when during the day, let's say for example the time of the dinosaurs, when a dinosaur happened to die in a swamp, for example, then the dinosaur's dead body would lay there in the soft soil, right? And then, as the years come by, there would be sediments that would be settling on top of the dead body, right? And see, sediments due to flooding and erosion can pile up quite a bit. Maybe the process is slow. Maybe it could take years to just create 1 millimeter thick of sediments, but slowly but surely that piles up. Okay, and then when the thing piles up, obviously, because there are more material on top than on the bottom, the pressure crushes the sediments together, and that's how you make sedimentary rocks, right? So if you started with a swamp with a soft mud, and then you have the dinosaur, and then you have layers of sediments, and then the sediments get crushed by its own pressure, and they fuse together to become a stone or a rock, what do you think will happen? Yes, the bones of that dinosaur will be preserved, sandwiched in the materials of the rock. So, modern archaeologists or paleontologists or fossil diggers would be able to find that rock, and then would be able to carve out the sediments, and then they can retrieve the bones. So these are fossils. So that's just one kind of fossil. That's a bone impression. But you can also have, for example, insects that are trapped in resin, in rubber resin. Because you see, you have trees that when you make when you are able to breach the skin, they produce a gum-like resin or tar. And let's say if an insect happened to be trapped inside that resin, then that resin solidifies, then you have another type of fossil. So basically, we, from the modern time, are actually able to dig up millions and millions of fossils of every different kind of animal that the earth has seen. And see, when we look at the fossils, there's a curious thing that happens, and that is, we see a gradual change in the properties of the different animals. So, for example, we can compare the structures, and we can see that there is a general trend of animals becoming more complex and more complex as years pass by. You never see a fossil that's older that's more complex than a fossil that is quite later in the timeline. So given that concept, then we can infer that evolution is true, because the main premise of evolution is that life started out as a simple organism, and that simple organism diversified, and it became more complex and more complex as the organisms evolved through the millions and millions of years of the Earth. So that's fossils. Evidence number two. Evidence number two is what we call comparative anatomy. So basically, what we do is we look at structures of the bones, of the muscles, of whatever anatomical feature of animals, and we map them together. Kind of like, how different is this animal from that animal? And we see that there are certain remarkable features. So for example, like a whale. Now, a whale is something that's swimming in the sea. And so we might think that that's fish, right? But if you actually look at the structures of a whale, compare it to a fish, it's not a fish. How do we know? Because, the particular structures are not there. The whale have no gills, for example. But if you look at the structure of a whale and a hippo, at first glance, at the physical properties, they are very different, because hippos are land animals, right? While whales are in the sea. But if you actually look at the anatomical structures, specifically the bone structure, the hierarchy of bones, whales are more related to hippos than to fish, right? So things like that make you think about the origins of these whales, right? And so if the anatomical structure of whales is more similar to that of hippos, then that begs the question, maybe they have a common ancestor. And so if we look at fossils, the first line of evidence, we can actually look at fossils of ancient whales, fossils of modern whales, fossils of modern hippos, and fossils of ancient ancestors of hippos. And you know what we know? We can actually trace that whales were actually from the ancestors of hippos. That at some point in time, there is a certain animal that was hippo-like, and then this certain animal actually thrived more in the sea, and some of its cousins thrived more in the land. And as the millions and millions of years passed by, the cousin that stayed on the land became the hippos, and the ancestors of that first hippo-like ancestor that went to the sea became whales, right? So that's the second line of evidence. The third line of evidence is what we call embryology. So embryology is when you look at embryos of developing animals. So if you look at the embryos of developing animals, you can see that there are similarities. So for example, the embryo of a human being and a chicken and a whale and a monkey, at some point in their development, they look the same. In fact, humans actually have a tail when you're still embryos, when you're still fetuses, but then at some point in the development, that tail becomes smaller and smaller until it's gone, right? So that begs the question, why would the embryo of a human being develop a tail-like appendage when we don't need it? What's the answer? The answer is maybe because we have the same lineage, that we actually came from the same genetic machinery, and so during the early stages of our development, we developed the same structures. But then, as we go further in the development, then our bodies would say, "Hey, wait a minute, we have already evolved, and we already don't need that tail appendage, so let's get rid of it." And so we don't develop the tail. But early in the embryo, you can see that there's really a tail, right? So that's embryology. Now the fourth evidence is biochemistry. So you see, biochemistry is the chemistry of biological sequences. So the most common example for this is, for example, if looking at a certain protein that is present in human beings and also present in monkeys and present in animals, in other animals, and we look at the sequences of amino acids that are produced, and guess what? The further you are from the evolutionary line, the more differences there are in the proteins. For example, if you have apes and human beings, the differences in our amino acid sequences are only minimal. But if you compare dogs and human beings, then you develop more differences. And if you go to fruit flies, then even more differences. And why is that? Well, because evolution predicts that. Evolution says that we actually developed from unicellular organisms, which became multicellular, cellular, some of which became plants, some of which became sponge-like organisms. The sponge-like organisms, some of them became worm-like organisms. The worm-like organisms became fish-like organisms. Fish-like organisms became amphibian-like organisms. Amphibian-like organisms became reptile-like organisms, and then reptile-like organisms became bird-like organisms, and some became mammals. So there's a branch there. And then mammals became apes, and then apes became human beings. So if you look at that hierarchy, apes and human beings are closer than apes and mammals. So it makes sense that when you look at the protein sequences, the amino acid sequences, there are more differences in the amino acid sequence between a mammal, such as a dog, and a human person than between a human person and an ape. Okay? So that's the fourth what?